I'm here to talk to you today not about product, not about breaking into things, anything like that. I'm here to talk to you about failure. And having been in this field in one shape or another for over 25 years, I've gotten really good at failing. So, failing's not a bad thing. So one of the really interesting things is I had a variant of this talk that I gave in India last week, and failure is typically not something that you talk about in Asia. And when I talked about it with them, they went, okay, wait, no, I see it differently now. The idea here is to have failure as a teaching tool. But before we get down that road, we'll talk a little bit of who I am. I'm the guy that was supposed to be here to give a keynote 2 years ago. We'll get into that in a little bit. Apologies. I have been doing this for quite a long time. I've done everything from being a firewall admin all the way through to being a CISO for a power company, and all points in between. And it has been really an interesting run. I've had the privilege rather, of being able to work with the sector conference in Toronto, founded B-Sides Toronto. I'm on the board of directors for B-Sides Las Vegas, rate for Forbes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Suffice to say, I don't sleep a whole lot. And one of the interesting things is along the way, you know, as security folks are wont to do, I picked up a moniker, and along the way I went, okay, now I have to change that moniker. So I've been using the moniker Gattaca ever since. I stole it directly from this film because my previous moniker had failed a lot too, to the tune of there's a couple countries I'm afraid to step foot in. They don't know who I am, but let's just keep it that way. So I am Canadian. I'm born and raised in Montreal, and moved out to Ontario back in '79. And I have been all over this great country, having a great deal of fun. But one of the really interesting things is I've lived in numerous places, I've been numerous places, and as a result of that, I have an accent that is not typically seen as Canadian unless I've had a few wobbly pops. And in so doing, people think I'm an American. This can be problematic. I was in India 2 years ago, and I was standing in a hotel lobby, a nice 5-star hotel, and this lady walked up to me, she goes, "Excuse me, are you an American?" I said, "No, actually I'm from Canada. Why?" She goes, "Good." And she turned and walked away. I was concerned enough at that point to say, okay, what if I had said yes? To the point where I now have a maple leaf tattooed on my arm just to make sure that I am properly authenticated. Speaking of which, I now work for Duo Security. Prior to this, I spent 5 years at Akamai Technologies doing pretty much the same role of running around the world talking to people about security issues. And having done 20 years as a defender and now on the vendor side, it is now fun for me because I get to talk with folks about their security issues. I don't have to worry about budgets. I don't have to worry about Billy stole your coffee cup. I don't have to worry about all that minutia. I can just talk about security issues. And that's a lot of fun for me. So I joined Cisco a few months ago, and then, well, now it's Cisco now. But I even get confused on stage on this one. But this is really awesome. We took a small 700-person shop and blew it up to 80,000. And my boss likes to say that, you know, Duo, Cisco, we're now Disco. And, you know, mad props to Wendy Nather, my boss. So that's a positive. That's not a failure. That's actually really awesome. But failure is something that we need to look at as a teaching tool. And there's nothing more of a failure than quoting yourself on stage in front of an audience. Silly me. But this is one of those things where things are going to happen no matter what you try to do. And as you go through your career, you're going to learn from these mistakes. Or at least I sincerely hope you do. Especially when you're trying to get to a conference called COUNTERMEASURE in 2016, and the airport in Frankfurt gets locked down. Right there, that's why. So that was this particular bag right here. Some knucklehead left it in the middle of the aisle in the airport in Frankfurt and decided to go shopping. This locked down the entire airport for several hours. Myself and several hundred of my closest friends missed all of our connections, and thus I got to spend an extra night in Germany. Fun and games. Now, as we go through our lives, there are signs everywhere. There are always signals and indicators and rules about how things are supposed to go. And these are the things that we, understand, but you have to work within it as a framework. Very much, steal a line from the Matrix, this is a system of rules. And we tend to break them as security folks, no matter how you slice it. That's why I like the term hacker, because this shows an intellectual curiosity. It is not a negative term. Unfortunately, the media took hold of it, and we need to take it back collectively as security practitioners, and we have to use the term attacker or something akin to that, because that shows criminal intent. Now, these days I get to talk a lot about security, but when I was younger, I really didn't have too many opportunities because I was meant to be seen, not heard. I was part of a baby boomer generation hatching. So I was a Gen Xer that came early on. And I tended to be very introverted, and I tended not to want to fail at anything. I wanted to make sure that I was very, very careful about how I did things in my life. And early on, before the internet, we had computers, and back in '86, we had computers in our classroom, and I looked at these and I thought, okay, this is really cool, and I figured out with a friend of mine very quickly that we could actually dupe video games and sell them to other people in school. Made a rather tidy profit. And then along came the internet. And there were all these really interesting aspects of it, and I was very fortunate that I got to start in this field of security very early on. I started out as a rapid application developer, and in my first job, within 10 days, I had joined the security team. And this was really, really fortunate because it's just right place, right time. This particular financial institution had 55,000 employees and one computer security person who was managing the firewalls for the entire company. Now, in the media, they like to talk about hackers and all the wonderful evil things that they do. And every time I see a picture of a hacker in the media, it tends to be somebody wearing a hoodie and wearing thick gloves and a balaclava. And unless you're sitting in a data center at 3 o'clock in the morning, you don't need these particular items. But we tend to get this really odd fixation. But in all reality, that's not the way it is. For example, I got onto an airplane not too long ago, and I had a hoodie on and jeans just because I wanted to be comfortable because it was a 14-hour flight. Sat down in my seat, and a lady coming by, she was all dressed up like she was going to Ascot, and she looked at me, she goes, "What are you doing sitting up here?" And it's just because that psychology is there, is the fact that I'm wearing a hoodie, that I must be some sort of nefarious character. And this is a really unfortunate bent. The reality is, this is what a hacker looks like. Anybody. It literally can be anybody. And as we go through these things, we have to learn from these lessons. And all through our careers, we're going to make mistakes. Now, when I say that we have to learn from failure, this is one of those things where we have to understand that it's not as simple as just go learn from it. It is an iterative process. I had a really interesting conversation last night with somebody who remained nameless because I won't out them in the middle of the crowd. But they had a very serious incident happen to them 3 years ago, and they had become very reticent to talk about any sort of security issues in the public eye. And I thought, okay, this is an unfortunate thing, but this is just it. It's an iterative process. There's a healing that people have to go through in order to get to that point where they can share their lessons learned with others, so hopefully they won't suffer the same issues. Like, for example, when you miss a plane when you're going to Hackfest in Quebec City to give the first ever security talk of your career, and you realize that, okay, that's not good, and you realize that if you did manage to catch the next flight, that you would go in, give a talk, and then you would have to sit in the airport until 5 o'clock in the morning to get the flight home again. So the guys at that conference actually created something they called B-Sides Dave. They actually made up t-shirts for me, and they were going to come sit with me in the airport, but ultimately that didn't happen. But I survived that. Nietzsche had this thing that he liked to talk about called the eternal return. And this is an item where he looks at the world as something that is a constant cycle. As we go through life, everything that we're doing is destined to repeat. We're going to go through life, and that all through time, this will be a continual loop. Sounds an awful lot like security, doesn't it? We tend to repeat ourselves, but that's just it. It doesn't have to be that way. We have it within ourselves to course correct. We need to change how we are doing things. For example, zero trust. How many people in here know what zero trust is? Show of hands. That's what I expected, because every different company has a different version of what that is. I like to look at it as stuff is on fire, and this is just it. We have been doing all the elements of a zero trust model for 20, 30 years. Network zone segmentation, authentication authorization, all of these different pieces that we go through in order to build out a solid security program. But nowadays, John Kindervag did us a real service by calling it zero trust. He gave it a label, and it rekindled that interest in doing the fundamentals right. And this is a really good thing, because collectively we need to learn these sort of lessons. Because if I have learned anything in my career, is that castles don't scale. This is one of those things. It's like, oh, it's okay, we got a firewall. If I had $1 for every time I heard it's okay we have a firewall, I'd have a really nice dinner at Morton's. And it's just an unfortunate cycle that we have to break out of. And when we're looking at these sort of things, we have to also look at things like passwords. Passwords are an antiquated notion. Back in 2012, I started tracking data breaches on my own site, Liquid Matrix, and I was going through, and the biggest breach we had at that time was a LinkedIn breach that came in about 6.5 million records. And at that time, that was pretty big. Now we're in the billions category for sites getting breached on a regular basis. This just really gives credence to the fact that we need to find a better solution to passwords. Because when you're coming in and saying, oh, is this a password? Well, there's no way to know that's you that has that password. You just happen to have the right authentication. And typically you have somebody going, no, go away until you get the right password. But one of the things that we have to understand is that security models have to change. This is one of those really interesting things. Before I ever got into computer security for a career, I was in university for classical studies and archaeology. Oddly enough, I actually heard from my university yesterday for the first time in 25 years, and apparently I owed them tuition fees, which was really interesting for courses that I took when I didn't live in the country. So that was fun. But this is actually a story from when I took my classes where the Visigoths sacked Rome. And what they did was they set up shop around the city and they cordoned it off. And then they waited. They used their own security defenses against them as a weapon. Eventually, it starved out the city to the point where the Romans just said, all right, we're done, open up the doors. The city was sacked, and that was the end of it. But that's just it. That is a model that was proven demonstrably failing in 410 AD. Yet today, we still do that whole mentality of, it's okay, we have the firewall, we have the perimeter, we have the DMZ. These are the type of things we need to learn from to move forward. We have to realize that while we're being environmentally friendly and reusing passwords, that's not a good idea. Full credit to Karen Elzeri, who gave that example at Sector a few months ago, or last month rather. That's just it. We do silly things over and over again and expecting a different result. What is the definition of insanity again? But that change is coming. We hear these stories, and I heard it in the last 2 days, where people are talking about they're concerned about their data being resident in other countries, if it's Ireland, US, and things like that. And at one point in my career, I was worried about that as well. I had a deep and abiding concern about where that data was being kept. At no point did the bit flip in my head going, wait a minute, this data is encrypted and I hold the keys. These are these are the types of things we need to look at differently. And as we're going through this and looking at these things differently, we have to adjust our thinking accordingly when we look at security overall. For example, this didn't need to happen. This is from WannaCry. These are screenshots that I got from around the world. This was a vulnerability that was known for 10 years before it was capitalized on in this particular piece of malicious software. These are the kind of things that don't have to happen. But if you take the proper security controls and put them in place, make sure you have proper network zone segmentation, well, not all controls are going to work out the way you want them, but you want to make sure that when the controls are in place that you are going to be sure that when you absolutely need that critical piece of data, that it will be available to you. Now, I just saw the Senate report from a couple days ago, okay, maybe not that Senate report, but the Senate report that came out by the Canadian government, and it was a great example of these, they're laying out the issues and talking about them. This is something that we need to do a collective better job of, talking about our security issues. It's the only way we're going to get to fix them. People always say, oh, we need better communication. We got to stop talking about it and just do it. My favorite was I was working for an energy company back in mid-2000s, and we were put on a phone call with the DHS. And this was a weekly phone call where we'd sit there and talk about security issues as it pertained to the grid. The best part was none of the Americans would say a single word when the Canadians were on the phone. It was the most unbelievable mouth breathing exercise I had ever encountered in my career. That was an abject failure. But it's something we had to learn from and move forward. We have to end a Cartesian join and make sure that we get off this eternal return that Nietzsche described and flip it on its head so that we can do better things. Otherwise, we're going to get stuck in this loop in perpetuity. Like, there's always this tired old adage, but I love to pull this one out of, remember when you had to be faster than the hiker that was behind you so that the bear wouldn't get you. But these days, there's bears everywhere. can be analogous to the Russians and things like that, or the market. These are the kind of things, security issues are going to keep coming up. You got to accept that failure is going to happen. And that's not a bad thing, as long as you can learn the lessons that are afforded to you through that failure and share those lessons with others. This is how we do a better job. Don't do the siloed approach of this is all mine. It's going to have an extremely limited return on investment. So back in the 90s, I was working as a defense contractor in the United States, and for my particular client, we had regularly getting attacked by all sorts of ne'er-do-wells that wanted to break into our systems. One day I showed up after not sleeping all night because I got into some really interesting security research. I got to the office, sat down, had my coffee, looked at the logs, and I saw there was this one particular IP address that had been wailing on us for the better part of several hours. I got mad. I hit them back. So I broke into their system. I left a note for the administrator saying, don't do this, this, and this. I said, really appreciate it if you cease and desist. And I left a burner email address so they could write me back. Didn't break anything. Thought I was okay. Next day I got an email. To their credit, they were very polite about it. They said, well, thank you for your note. We really appreciate all the things that you pointed out that we needed to fix. Small problem, though. You got one of the octets wrong. I actually had breached a system that was nothing to do with the IP address that was coming after us. Let this be a lesson for you that hacking back doesn't work. Or get some sleep before you do it. That was something that I learned, very valuable lesson that day, and to this point I have still never advocated for hacking back. But it doesn't really end there. So these mistakes can happen. Now remember, with the hackback thing, I missed by 1 octet. I got a number wrong. In this particular scenario, I had a vendor come to me and say, look, we have this really cool vulnerability scanning project, who will remain nameless. We'd love to scan your network for you just to give you a sample report so you can see how it is. And I was like, oh, free is good. And they went, oh, yeah, okay, free. So they said, oh, just give us your IP block. And I said, all right. Gave it to them, and that's a Class B. Yeah, we're a power company. Oh. They did it anyway. They scanned the whole thing. Got the report, and bless their hearts, they printed it out for me. It was about that thick. And I'm looking at this in the courier box and going, how could it be this thick? But because I knew that particular IP block wasn't overly populated. Open it up, start flipping through it. Pardon me. There were all sorts of printers that were vulnerable to this, that, and the other thing. There were FTP systems that were allowing anonymous logins. I'm like, okay, that's neat. I don't know where these all came from. And as we're going through, I realized the IPs were all tracking back to Shenzhen, Beijing, Shanghai. The vendor got the IP block wrong. So I promised, and I will maintain that to this day, that I will not name who that was. But again, simple mistake could have caused a bit of an international incident. So when these security issues happen, and they will happen, you really have to learn to go to your happy place. You need to relax, because these are the moments that we learn from. And don't fear the failures. Failures can happen even when you have the best of intentions. Case in point, the TACOMA Narrows Bridge. And of course, I have my sound on, but whatever. Let's just do that. There we go. So this was a bridge that built. It was newly opened, and it started doing this. It was cavitating in the weirdest way because there was a strange anomaly that was a result of harmonics and wind, and I can't remember how it all goes. But all the best plans they tried to do, set it up, this still happened. Ultimately, when they rebuilt this bridge a few miles away, they were able to mitigate this particular problem. But even when you take the steps to make sure everything is secure, something like this could still happen. And you have to always be preparing yourself for these sort of things. Ultimately, this bridge does collapse. I don't know if we're going to get to that part in the video before I lose my focus. But thankfully, no people passed away in this. Unfortunately, one dog did actually expire as a result of this particular bridge collapse. But that's just it. Best intentions, planning was all there, but this still happened because they hadn't accounted for something they didn't know about. And sometimes when people don't know about things, we have to make sure that we don't jump down their throats. When I was working for another company, we had a gating process where any new web application that was going to go into production had to come through our team. So This particular project had gone live before coming to speak to us, but we thought, all right, that's not a big deal. We'd have known about it. It was only been live for about an hour. So I sat down. I said, okay, I'll do a quick analysis of it. And the first thing I do is view source, right there. So and this is a browser, view source, right there, that. So can you imagine what I found when I opened up that particular web application? Any takers? Commented out in the code, username, admin, password, admin. This was facing the outside world for an hour. Pulled the plug pretty quick. But the really interesting thing here wasn't that I didn't lose my cool. I didn't jump up and down and scream and yell. The manager for the particular application development team, he said, I hacked their application. This is a true story. My initial reaction was one of complete and utter disdain, but thankfully, I had the wherewithal not to blow my toes off. I realized he didn't know any better. I had internally made the assumption that he would just know not to do that, but he didn't even know the browser. You could do view source and see what was there. This was a real troubling thing because I realized this wasn't so much his failure as it was mine. Myself and my team had not taken the time to sit with them and explain what we expected of them. We had not gone through and looked at what could go wrong. So this is one of those moments where I had to take the sword tip, put it against my chest, and lean forward. But sometimes when you do that, and sometimes when you fix all the problems, it doesn't mean that they're not going to come back. This here is an actual screenshot from a company that I had left a couple weeks earlier. And a former coworker of mine, sent me an email, said, you want to check this link out. So this was developer.company.com//, but at the end of it, if you can't see it, it says equal Etsy password. Dumped out the whole password file. And this was absolutely maddening because this was a problem that we spent 6 months fixing, and as soon as I was out of the building, they unwound it. Absolutely stunning. But that's just it. People are going to use tools and do things that you never expect. You give them a hammer, they're going to make soup. You're never going to be sure what's happening next. Or they'll ask for tools that do nothing, but look really shiny. Yes, I'm digging on them. Apparently, these guys still exist. So, as uncomfortable as that is, in our careers, we need to feel uncomfortable. We need to be always challenging ourselves, especially as security practitioners, because nothing ever stays the same way. There are things that are constants, like vulnerabilities that haven't been patched in 10 to 15 years. One case in point, every year, every publication likes to do, what do they call it? Either a year in review or predictions. So I did a prediction of what the next 10 vulnerabilities were going to be for the next year. And it got all sorts of responses, and people were like, oh, that's really cool. Little did they know is I had done a copy-paste of a top 10 from 10 years earlier. Of that top 10, can anybody guess how many of those vulnerabilities were still in play? Close, 9. 10 years later, 9 of those 10 vulnerabilities were still in the wild. Now, this is just that thing. We can do a better job. We can get off that eternal return. We need to sit down and evaluate where we are in our career. Are we comfortable in doing what we're doing as our day jobs, or do we need to challenge ourselves and move forward? And that's only a question you guys can answer yourselves. What tools do you have available to yourself to help you choose that career path? Do you want to give talks at a conference? Do you want to write papers? Are you going to learn projects on the side? When you have things like AWS and Google's Cloud and Azure and all these things, you have all these opportunities to build out networks that just simply weren't around when I started. I literally had to cobble together hardware from various projects and build little labs and watch the power bill spike, and thankfully my boss never said anything. But that's just it. You want to make sure you're building a solid foundation for yourself because things are going to go wrong. And when you're building out not only your career, but anything you're working on, you want to make sure that you're building it to fail. What do I mean by that? You want to make sure that it's not 5 nines. 5 nines is dead and dusted. We want to make sure that it is built to be 100% uptime, whatever it is. And in these days, that is actually feasible. That is possible. Except when the consultant comes in to do a project for you and sits down at $2,000 a day, and the first thing he does on day one is open up the manual and start on the first page. This happened to me while I was at Black Hat, where my second, he calls me up. He's like, "You're never going to believe this. We had this consultant come in to do a project for us, and this is exactly what he did." I sincerely hope that he learned from his mistakes, because unfortunately, that actually cost him his job that very day. These are the kind of things that we make sure that we're doing our homework. It's constant. We can't just stay still. And we have to understand that things can and they will go wrong. So, when you are in your career, one of the things I get a lot of questions about is like, how do you get into blogging? How do you get into this and writing and all the rest of it? Honestly, you just take your shot. You just sit down and do it. I started my website almost 21 years ago now. Literally because I was finding articles, I was sharing them at work, and people said, "Oh, this is kind of cool. Where did you find it?" And then I realized that most people didn't have access to this information at that time. It was before aggregators were a thing. So I built up my own site, which was, I guess, a blog before blogs were blogs. But this was a great way to share information. And it was just very much an altruistic endeavor. And over time, that helped me build out my career, helped me build out my understanding of things. And the only reason that it worked for me is because I just kept at it. I had so many emails from people over time that told me I was a complete moron. I had no idea what I was doing. And I'm like, "Oh, great, thanks. Thanks, Mom." But it was a great iterative process. It helped me to learn by putting myself out there, by taking that chance. And for people that say they don't have the ability to do X, whatever X may be, this is my field where I grow. I'll leave it there. We need to make sure that we are looking beyond the haze. Far too often I find a lot of security practitioners, and more of us are actually leaving social media platforms, they'll get wrapped up in these silly little bun fights between each other about, who's a better hacker than who and all this sort of thing. It's like absolutely of no value. But we as practitioners get lost in that. Same thing with the zero-day vulnerability. When that comes out, we go, "Oh, we got to pay attention to this." Meanwhile, the Oracle databases haven't been patched in 3 years. We need to make sure that we're maintaining our focus, because otherwise we'll start spiraling into dark places and we'll start thinking things very much in a negative vein towards ourselves and towards others. And that's where you get very jaded security professionals and we get lost in the minutia. We miss those fine details. Before I go too much further, all of the pictures in here that you're seeing are actually by my friend Pam Julian. I just want to give her credit for that. I use them rather liberally. So here's an idea. Ask for help. Are you working on something or you want to learn something? Ask for help. You have OWASP groups in here. You have B-Sides groups here. You have all sorts of community endeavors. You have Countermeasure right here. Network with your peers. I realize this is the last talk on the last day, but take this as your homework assignment when you leave. Make sure that you reach out to folks and make these connections, because you have a very solid foundation here as a security community. And understand that in so doing, you're going to learn and hopefully avoid problems like this. First time I ever gave a talk akin to this, 2 hours before I went on stage, somebody sent me this. This was a data security company, and this is not to bash on them particularly, but it's to learn that it could happen to anybody. yourdataissecured.com was not exactly secured. Their entire site was tied up in a SQL database there and free to anybody who could download it. We all want security for ourselves. We all want that security, but we don't typically personalize that. For example, how many people here, and don't look at the camera when I say this, how many people in here have a home alarm? Don't put your hands up. Just think about that for a second. Oh, one guy puts his hand up. All right, thanks for coming out. All right. But that's just it. It's like, was that because your house was broken into, or you're just professionally paranoid? For me, it's like one of those things. I suffered through a data breach for one company I was working at, where a site that we were told by our marketing team was going to be taken down was still up 2 weeks later and ended up on the front page of the CBC and several other publications that got compromised. And I felt so bad that I didn't sleep for 3 nights because I took it very personally. Not because the marketing team didn't take it down, but because I didn't follow up with them to make sure they took it down. We as security practitioners need to own that particular aspect of things. Far too often we do, it was his fault. That's not going to help us move the ball further down the road. In addition to reaching out, you also have to trust your team that you're working with in the event you're working with a team. You have to be able to have that synchronicity with them because there is safety in numbers, and it gives you that chance to learn because everybody has a different skill set. We all have an opportunity to learn from each other, and we want to make sure that we're not running ourselves aground. I've seen too many of my friends burn themselves out and unfortunately are no longer with us today because they didn't have the wherewithal to reach out. They didn't have the moment to pause and say, I need help. Make sure you're able to do that. Make sure you're able to cut the tether as well as you're going through. Don't get stuck on these preconceived notions. It's okay, we have a firewall, everything's good. Preconceived notion. Consider that that's not enough. Somebody comes to work one day and they're in a really bad mood, that firewall is not going to help you. You need to find a balance in your career. You want to make sure that you're taking time to be at home. I travel a great deal for my job, and a lot of people have asked me, how do I do it? But it only ends up being about 42% travel over the year over year, which for me is actually manageable. I've had friends that did 90% travel. That cost them more than they care to admit. Now, when you're having an interview, one of the questions always comes up is, where do you see yourself in 5 years? I used to hate that question. But then I realized it's taking a moment to pause and plan, what do I want to do next? Again, this is a learning process. We have to make sure that as we're going through our career, we're constantly challenging ourselves, looking for the next thing. Because if we're just stuck in a lather, rinse, repeat, what's the value? And if you have a plan in place to understand where you want to go next, and plans change. They don't ever stick the same way, ever. But if you have that plan, you've got that ace in the hole, and you need to be able to make yourself take chances. Now, one chance that I took years ago, I was working for a bank in Toronto, and I met a young lady when I was on training. Now, this was back in the early days. It was called NetRanger, or Wheel Group NetRanger. Ultimately ended up being Cisco IDS. And there was myself, a whole room of gray hair, and this young lady came in and sat down, and we ended up hacking into each other's computers and sending each other notes. We ended up hitting it off, having a relationship. Little did we know that the entire thing was recorded and to this day is still used as a teaching tool for that course. I wonder if they'll give me credit for that now that I work for the company. But that's just it. Is we went through that, and then I decided I was going to move down to Charleston, South Carolina to be with her, and much to my chagrin, I was single before the plane landed. That was fun. You don't always win, but you got to take that chance. Otherwise, you'll never find out. The best thing that happened to me was that I did take that chance. I did move down there. Even though the relationship fell apart, I had a great job. I ended up working on projects for the Pentagon, the FBI, US Navy, all kinds of amazing things. I was talking about how to properly shield devices in outer space. It was an amazing opportunity. And otherwise, I would have been stuck doing the same job at that particular financial institution. That failure of my relationship falling apart ended up leading to a success. Now, again, back to the site I was talking about earlier, this was an early iteration of Liquid Matrix where I literally took the HTML framework from hackernews.com, my friend Space Rogue, and used it for my own site. It looks like this today, but that's just one of those things, is over time these things have developed and have grown much in the way as my career has too. These are the tools that you use to help better yourself as well as sharing the information with others. Because sometimes things will go well, other times they'll go horribly squiffy. The Morris worm is a great example. Morris worm got out, ran rampant across the internet, but that was never the intention of the worm's creator. Mistakes are going to happen. We have to have the skills in place to tackle these issues when they do. Unfortunately, as security practitioners, this is how we tend to see the world. You against everybody. That's not a great way to be. We need to stop aligning against ourselves. We need to do a better job of communicating within our own peer groups and understanding what we don't know and sharing what we do. Because otherwise, things like this are going to happen when you have CNN talking about the hacker 4chan, which was not a hacker. Another thing entirely. That was one of my favorites of all time. You need to share those war stories that you have. particular example was one company I was working with. I controlled all of the IDS system for that particular company, and I wouldn't let anybody touch it. I handled all the patching. I handled all the log review, every aspect of it, because I didn't have the wherewithal to trust our maintenance team to take care of it, much to my own failing. Ultimately, I did learn to let go when my mentor said, this is the only way you're going to grow is when you let go of that system, because I didn't understand that once I let go of it, there's 18 million other things that I could work on. I learned to let go. See ya. Sorry, that was just too easy there. Later. So another example of where things can go wrong, I was working for a company that had a global footprint. And in this global footprint, we had a flat network. So imagine that, a flat network, global, MPLS circuits as far as the eye can see. This was one of those crazy moments where we had a group in one of our Southeast Asia offices that had decided they wanted to download crack movies until the cows came home. MPAA and RIA showed up in my office. They were not happy. And we couldn't understand for the life of us how this was ever happening. We looked at the log files. We went through them and said, look, there is nothing in these log files, until we sent a guy there from another office. He flew in, and he did a hard target search, and he looked through it, and he found out that the characters in that office had actually gone to the length of building a stub network that routed around the firewall. We were checking the firewall logs. We weren't checking the edge router. Failure on our part, but we learned a valuable lesson that day. Thankfully, MPAA and RIA went away as soon as we explained the whole thing, and that was actually a surprise all by itself. So when things go wrong, it can go one of two different ways. It all depends on how you frame that discussion. You want to make sure that you don't get lost in the minutia of it, and make sure you pull back and say, what is the value that I can learn from this particular problem? And those problems will keep coming. Another power company that I worked for, we had this really interesting thing. We had this strange noise that was coming out of the floor. So we went out into the raised floor, and we got the tile lifter. Nothing there. Nothing there. Third tile we lift up. There's a Cisco 1750 blinking back at us that nobody knew existed. This particular company used to be part of a larger company, and it's been split into 5 other companies. And this turned out to be a hard link back to one of those other companies, which is, for all intents and purposes, a competitor. But they didn't know it was there either. That could have gone so horribly, horribly wrong, because it wasn't documented, but we actually shared that lesson. And I will talk about this until I'm blue in the face at every conference that I go to, because this is a great example of always be checking everything. You want to make sure you're sharing the lessons learned. We fail, we learn, and we grow. And we can grow not only as individuals, but as a community. You have to sit down and realize that you're not alone, especially when you consider that somebody pitched an idea so crazy that it took off. Got to refocus our lens on how we see the world. Last week I was in India, and I had a day where I was able to get away to Agra. So I took a train out there, and I got to ride in a tuk-tuk for the first time in my life. It's a small little scooter type vehicle, and this is my view from the back seat. Or rather, this is my view as I was in the back seat, because wow, traffic in India is something else. But the rewards are out there if you take that chance. You put yourself out there, and you realize there are opportunities out there if you take that chance. You move beyond your comfortable spot. And I never thought I'd find a moment of zen in a Marvel film, but if you've seen the movie Doctor Strange, there's one in there. It's not about you, it's about all of us. We can step off that eternal return. I'd like to thank you, to all of you, to Countermeasure, and all the crew, and for all the sponsors, and making sure that this conference happened, and I really appreciate you having me here today. Thank you.